Ever thought about what actually happens in a legal sense when you cross a border? Turns out every single country has a set of rules for visitors. Think of it like a global rulebook for guests. So let's dive in and unpack what that rulebook really says. So let's just start with the biggest question of all, right? Who actually gets to decide who comes in and who has to stay out? Is it some international committee? Is it based on old traditions? What's the deal? Well, the answer is that it's all run by a very specific and, pretty complex legal system. The official name for this whole rulebook is Xenial law. That's the framework countries use to handle anyone who isn't one of their own citizens. Okay, to really get our heads around this system, we've got to start at the very beginning. So in our first section, let's look at the core idea that gives every nation the right to even make these rules in the first place.
And it all comes down to one hugely important word: sovereignty. This is the absolute bedrock of all of it. It's the idea that a state has the final, exclusive say over its own territory and its own borders. This is the why behind every single passport stamp and visa application.
What's so interesting here is you can really see how an idea has evolved over time. I mean, for centuries, how you treated a stranger was all about these informal customs of hospitality. But today, that ancient concept has been baked into this super-structured legal system, Xenial law, that's constantly trying to balance being welcoming with, being in control. All right, let's move on to our next section, because these laws aren't just abstract ideas. They're about defining and categorizing the actual people crossing these borders every single day. So at the very heart of this is one key legal term: the foreigner. And this isn't just a casual word we throw around. In law, it means something very specific. It's any non-citizen, and the whole point is that their rights and their obligations are legally different from a citizen's. That single distinction is what this entire system is built on.
And this is where things get even more specific, because not all foreigners are in the same boat. And this is a really, really important distinction to understand. There's a massive legal difference between a migrant, that's someone moving for, say, work or family under normal immigration rules, and a refugee, who is literally fleeing for their life and is protected by a totally different set of international humanitarian laws. The reason why they're moving changes everything, legally speaking.
And then there's a third group to consider: the undocumented. These are people who, for a whole host of reasons, are inside a country without official legal status. And that situation, as you can imagine, puts them in a really vulnerable spot and creates some of the toughest legal and ethical problems for governments to solve.
Okay, so we've got the core principle down, and we've talked about the people. So now, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the actual tools of the system. We're talking about the documents that control and allow all this movement. First up, the one we all know, the passport. But it's way more than just a little book with stamps. Legally, it's certifying two critical things: who you are, your identity, and maybe even more importantly, which country you belong to, which nation is responsible for you out in the world. But, having a passport doesn't mean you can just go anywhere you want. Often you need a visa. And the best way to think about a visa is not as a right, but as a permission slip. It's a country giving you conditional permission to enter for a specific reason and for a specific amount of time. And if you stick around longer than you're supposed to, that's called an overstay, and that can get you into some real trouble. So for someone who wants to make a new country their permanent home, there's usually a pretty clear path. It's a multi-step journey. As you can see here, it typically kicks off with a temporary visa for a specific purpose. From there, you might be able to get a green card, which means you're a lawful, permanent resident. And the final step for many is naturalization. That's the whole legal process of actually becoming a full citizen of that new country. This brings us to a really crucial part of the whole system, this constant and sometimes tricky balancing act between the rights that foreigners have and the power a country has to enforce its own rules. And this is so important to get. Just because you're not a citizen doesn't mean you have zero rights. Not at all. Both international law and the laws in many countries give foreigners key protections, like the right to due process, the right to not be discriminated against, and the right to call their embassy if they get into trouble.
Now, one of the most powerful protections out there is something called asylum. It's basically a massive humanitarian exception to a country's total control over its borders. Think of it like a safe harbor, a special protection for people who have a legitimate fear that they'll be persecuted if they're sent back home.
Of course, on the flip side of all these rights and protections, you have enforcement. And the ultimate enforcement tool a state has is deportation. This is the official legal process a country uses to kick out a non-citizen who has broken the rules or is seen as a risk.
Okay, now what about holding people accountable across borders? This is where a pretty unique and fascinating legal tool comes into play, mostly in the US. It's called the Alien Tort Statute. And to put it simply, it can allow foreigners to use American courts to sue for huge violations of international law, even if the bad stuff happens somewhere else entirely. It's a powerful and definitely controversial way to try and add a layer of global accountability.
All right, we're in the home stretch. We've seen the big ideas, the people, the paperwork, and the protections. So for our last section, let's pull it all together and see where and how this system actually works in the real world.
So where does the rubber meet the road on all this? Well, it mainly happens in 3 key places. You've got the embassy, that's the diplomatic front line where visas get issued. You've got the border zone itself, the physical place where the rules get enforced. And then you have treaties. Those are the high-level agreements between countries that actually write the rules in the first place.
You know, sometimes a single sentence just nails it. And this quote from our source material does exactly that. It says the system orchestrates the interplay between welcome and regulation, movement and control, protection and enforcement. And that, right there, perfectly captures that constant, delicate balancing act that Xenial law is all about.
So there you have it, a quick tour of the global rulebook. But here's the thing, it's not some dusty old book sitting on a shelf. It's a living document, constantly changing as our world changes. Which leaves us with one last big question to chew on. As things like climate change, new technology, and global economics keep reshaping our planet, how is this fundamental rulebook for guests going to be rewritten for the future?